Okay, official good evening to everyone, and welcome to our next study. We are going to be beginning in just a few moments our study of the book of Ecclesiastes. So far, I've received a couple of completed tests, and appreciate those who have sent those in. Just a reminder to those who haven't. Again, we're lenient with those deadlines, but challenge yourself to do this if you can at all. I don't want you to see where I did call it an optional test because, again, I'm happy you're here. I don't want you to feel obligated to take the course for credit, but at the same time, I would love to see you challenge yourself and take full advantage of the opportunity that you're being presented. There's something to be gained by preparing your mind to take a test. It helps you to further embed this material into your heart, which is, again, the aim. So I just would love to see you take that test if at all possible. I understand that there are circumstances that are pressing upon some of you, and coming into the holiday season, and that no doubt makes things difficult as well. So we'll definitely be flexible with deadlines, but just want you to try to do that if you at all possibly can. So if you there's a couple of you that did reach out to me. I've gotten those notes, and of course, approved extensions. But if you fall into that third category of I haven't gotten a test and I haven't heard from you, try to let me know. And then also, if you can, of course, if you've decided not to take the test, change your mind and take it. But let's get into our study of the book of Ecclesiastes now. And so we will do our best to be going verse by verse through the book of Ecclesiastes. So the aim roughly is going to be to cover 4 chapters a night, and that will carry us through the end of our time. We do still have, of course, one video that you will be receiving on the Song of Solomon, and then just a reminder that your final exam will consist of Job, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. So we'll try to get that video for the Song of Solomon done probably sometime this week or next week. It's didn't get a chance to last week, but I definitely have it on the radar, and so we're working towards that. So Ecclesiastes, in terms of wisdom literature, it's one of the more abused books. There's when someone has an atheistic perspective, they love seeing Ecclesiastes in the Bible. They also love the fact that people of faith are not very well acquainted with it. And so they go, do you know that there's, basically the atheistic worldview found in your Bible, and here it is. And so, there's some things that we need to know about the book of Ecclesiastes that, one, will not make it something that atheists can use for their, armaments against Christianity and against faith. But then two, that will help us to rightly divide it and make use of it for ourselves. So, first of all, the title Ecclesiastes, not a word you say every day. I really, when I first started preaching, and both to show you the common perception of the book, how people use it or don't, and then just a little funny story. I was preaching in East Tennessee, and in East Tennessee, the particular place where I was. I don't want to speak poorly of the brethren there by any means, but it was one of those places where we needed to do a lot of grounding and fundamentals. And there was one of the Christian ladies there who claimed that she hated the old Bible. I said, the old Bible? What's she talking about? And it was the Old Testament that she hated. She hated the Old Testament. And, there were other members who said similar things. And I was preaching one morning, and I had a scripture reading that I wanted to be done out of the book of Ecclesiastes. And I gave the reading on a piece of paper or something to a man. And he said, he came up to me just before services started. He said, what's that word? And I said, what word? And he pointed to the title of the book. It's Ecclesiastes. And I said, Ecclesiastes. And then ended up, when he did the scripture reading, he got up there and went, something like that. It wasn't quite audible whenever he was trying to pronounce there, but clearly didn't have a lot of experience with the book, and a lot of people don't. Title is a Greek or a Latin word. Latin derives it from Greek. That means something like the person who gathers the congregation. And so, not necessarily the way that it is translated in English, because as you're going to see, the word that's translated in English carries with it a lot of weight. It corresponds to this Hebrew word koheleth, which is frequently translated the preacher. And so that's the effectively the English title of the book, if you were to ultimately translate it, because we have Ecclesiastes, which is just a loan word from Greek or Latin, and then that's itself a translation of a Hebrew word, and then you have ultimately our word, the preacher. That's the Hebrew the word translated from Hebrew into our language. So basically, then we have a title that is borrowed from the opening, the opening of the book. This is typical of the Hebrew scriptures. Oftentimes, the name of a book would be derived from the first word, and so you have the term koheleth, or preacher, found in chapter 1 and verse 1, and also chapter 1 and verse 12. As you're engaging this, though, obviously this is before the church, and so don't see a New Testament preacher when you're understanding, who the one who's speaking, the role of the one who is speaking in this book plays. But really, what you're seeing is sort of a biographical sermon. You can kind of think about Paul telling the story of his conversion. At certain points in the story of his conversion, if you were to stop him short, you might misunderstand what he was really talking about. Maybe he would be talking about, his time as a Pharisee and how he had persecuted the church and made, those kind of statements. If you just cut them off there, then you wouldn't get the point of the message. And so the same thing sometimes happens with people as they're understanding this biographical sermon. They really cut off in their understanding the preacher here in the first 6 chapters, which they ought not do. And so we got to let the story continue to get the full picture. Who is the preacher, though? Well, so the name is never given of the preacher, but there are several identifying characteristics. One, he claims to be the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Now, that kind of settles it for some people, but I will say this about, in terms of examining son of as a concept in the Bible, what is the little asterisk that you have to kind of put on son of, as just in terms of understanding it the way that the Hebraic people understood it? How did their concept of son of differ from our concept of son of?
Well, how do I say this? Whenever we see father, it can mean any ancestor up the line.
Yep.
Right. And likewise, son could mean any descendant. Also, it could even be more vague in that coming from owing my faith to owing my whatever to this kind of father figure, this inspirational figure or whatever. So it could be either just partially one step off from father, being son as grandson, great grandson, whatever, or it could be even further and more symbolic. So a bit tricky.
Yeah, so in terms of the way that they use the term literally, or the concept literally, they would use it to refer to any descendancy. So Christ was a son of David. Well, that doesn't mean that he's the child of David through Bathsheba. It means that he came from the lineage of David. And then also there's that sort of, what Nicholas was talking about, that sort of, symbolic or metaphorical kind of son of, where we're really just talking about an association with or a connection to something, and sort of maybe even the concept of, like a quality. You think of Joseph being surnamed or nicknamed Barnabas, the son of encouragement. Well, encouragement's not a thing, but he is an encourager. And so that's how they use that concept. So all right, well, let's continue though and see how he identifies himself further. So he is king over Israel. Now that kind of forces your hand one way or the other, mostly. When you're thinking about the United Kingdom, the divided kingdom, it's not so common for the Southern Kingdom for the Southern kings to be referenced as being kings over Israel. So we've got, our eyes are drawn towards the United Kingdom, but possibly, Northern Kingdom king with that kind of a statement, although doesn't really work, does it? Because the Northern Kingdom kings were not descendants of David. All right, so pretty narrowed. He'd gotten more wisdom than anyone before him, he says in chapter 1 and verse 16. Now there, our mind is really narrowing now because we're thinking about biblical accounts of people who received wisdom from God. We know that there are various wise individuals accepted into council, but when we try to think of kings in that category, we're really struggling to think of any other name but who? Solomon, right. So there we go. And then we further find confirmation of this thought by finding that this man who authored this book was also the author of many proverbs. And so you really can't escape that idea. Now I say that, but the attempt of academia is always to try to escape the inescapable as relates to especially things like authorship. It doesn't say Solomon and therefore. But I refuse to think that with these kind of claims that we have any sort of, and I don't think that there's any such thing in Scripture as pseudepigrapha. I think pseudepigrapha, those books are rightfully marked as being non-canonical. If you're not familiar with that term, pseudepigrapha is a book that is ascribed to a falsely ascribed to an author, like the Gospel of Peter, Peter didn't write it, but the person wanted to cash in on Peter and pretend as though he's writing for Peter's perspective, and so he says the Gospel of Peter. Well, it's not Peter, and so I don't think that we've got a pretender in this book, and I also don't think that anyone makes sense given these descriptions. Believing in the inspired inerrant word and taking the most logical meaning of all of these descriptions, we're left with Solomon. So the preacher is almost certainly Solomon, the only one who can meet these requirements. Okay, so the question is now, what's going on here? What is the preacher trying to do in this biographical sermon? Well, effectively, what we have is an account of Solomon deciding to perform an experiment, and then we're seeing its outcomes. So the experiment effectively is given to us in chapter 1 and verse 13. Can someone read that for us, please?
Sorry, which verse?
Chapter 1 and verse 13.
Chapter 1, verse 13. And I apply my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. It is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. Okay,
so already, kind of an indictment on the exercise in the second part of that verse, but the aim of Solomon is found in the first part of the verse. I set my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all that is done under heaven. Now, so what are we doing really here? We're trying to find under heaven, in other words, effectively without heaven's purposes being considered, some alternate way of finding happiness, fulfillment, success. So we're going to, Solomon has all this wisdom, which of course has come from God, but with his wisdom, a sort of self-wisdom has arisen, or I won't call it self-righteousness as such, but certainly a self-reliance has sort of come into the picture. And he says, okay, I'm going to put my hand and sort of block out the idea of God for a minute, and I'm going to see whatever is left, if I can find in whatever is left something of real value that supplants and effectively replaces God. And so he wants to, as he says here, seek and search out concerning all that is done under heaven. And he wants to find what is good for men, as he goes on to say in chapter 2 and verse 3. And I'll go ahead and read this for the sake of time. I searched in my heart how to gratify my flesh with wine, while guiding my heart with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, until I may know what was good for the sons of men to do under heaven all the days of their lives. What really is the best way to live? What is going to find, what is going to result in the most fulfillment? So essentially, what you find Solomon doing is attempting to answer the question, what is the purpose of life? But attempting to answer it not merely philosophically, but experientially. Not merely discussing an idea, but saying, I've tried this and I've determined that it is not, that it is found wanting because of this, that, or the other. So that's effectively what we're going to see. We're going to see him saying, I returned and I tried this, and this is the effect, or this is the thing I realized. This is why it wasn't good. And so to answer the question, he tries everything that man typically tries. That doesn't mean that, we find a detailed account of like skydiving, or, like the nuanced kind of things that people do. We're thinking of big picture categories. And in those big picture categories, we're going to see recreation, we're going to see relationship, we're going to see wealth building, we're going to see the typical big picture categories that people fall into. And people do fall into these categories, and some even are aware that they are trying to find fulfillment in these things. Used to go door knocking using that method where you ask the question of the people, and you say, which of these questions is most interesting to you? And one of them is, what is your purpose in life? I remember one guy telling me when I asked him that, he said, yeah, what's your purpose in life is the question that interests me the most. And I said, okay, well, what do you think about that? He said, my purpose in life is to make money. And I was like, okay. And it's like, how's that going? Yeah, pretty well. I'm making money. So, he hasn't yet realized what we're going to see Solomon realizes. And so we are actually granted through inspiration the opportunity to learn from someone who was able to pursue these things, not only with resources, but with wisdom. Certainly, it's sad that Solomon is living his life this way, as we're going to see, and that sorrow is even borne out in the book. But God certainly did something helpful with it in giving us the record. Solomon was uniquely qualified to perform such an experiment. Like I said, not only does he have, obviously exceptional wisdom, but also he has exceptional resources. We see that before he became a king, he's told by God to ask for what he wishes. Of course, he says in 1 Kings chapter 3 and verse 5, God says, ask what I shall give to you. In the following verses, Solomon asks effectively for wisdom, but then there's this promise of God because of what he's asked. In verse 11, it says, then God said to him, because you've asked this thing and have not asked long life for yourself or riches for yourself, nor have asked for the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern justice, behold, I've done according to your words. See, I've given you a wise and understanding heart, so that there has not been anyone like you before you, nor shall any rather like you arise after you. And I have also given you what you haven't asked for, both riches and honor, so that there will not be anyone like you among the kings all your days. And then the promise was that if he continued to walk in the statutes of God, that he would also have a long life. He had a pretty decent lifespan. It's interesting to think about how long his life might have been had he lived differently. Could he have experienced more like a Moses kind of lifespan? I don't know, but he certainly did have wealth, and of course had wisdom. So,
Patrick,
Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering, because he has the God-given wisdom at this time.
Yeah.
Because of that, he's questioning these things about life even more.
I don't know that the God-given part of it would be what's questioning, but when you think about the wisdom that God gave, the great display of his wisdom is the way that he handled, or the case study in his wisdom, let me say that, is the way that he handled those two women and the baby, and so evidently his wisdom was not just about, those things which are spiritual. It was very practical, right? And you get that sense also when you're studying the Proverbs, right? I mean, we talked about how the Proverbs do discuss matters of spirituality, but then they also discuss matters of what's ultimately entirely practicality. And so I think that effectively what Solomon did was put a tack on all that spiritual wisdom and then kind of delved into the depths of the practical, but allowed that to overshadow the spiritual. And that happens sometimes, I think about Paul saying of the calling of the Corinthian brethren, how not many wise, not many mighty, not many noble were called. And there is something that happens as we get more education. We can very easily lose sight of what is real and what is true. And like
I was thinking, he was wise enough to ask for wisdom.
Yeah.
To start with, so that was wise of him to do that.
Yeah.
But with all that wisdom that he got, it didn't translate. It didn't translate into aspects of his life, like all the wives. You think.
Yeah. Well, not ultimately.
With all that wisdom, you think it'd be.
Well, I think that this little game that he decided to play was ultimately the unraveling of that. Let's talk about these periods of his life, because I think that's going to help to frame this and see how there was a time when Solomon's wisdom found harmony with his spirituality. There was a time when he became too self-reliant through wisdom, and then there was a period of regret. So let's talk about the three periods. So period one, as we're going to call it, is a period in which he was focused on God. And by the way, this is perfect test fodder. This is the kind of stuff that will definitely come up on a test. So period one, he's focused on God. And so in this time, you suspect this is when he probably completed his first inspired work, the Song of Solomon, the story, between of him discovering love in the Shulamite and God using that as a vehicle for teaching about married love. And you say, well, there would be other people that might be better to teach about married love, given Solomon's polyamory, marrying multiple spouses and so on. But having said that, there is something special and profound in the story that unfolds there, and we're going to talk about what that is as we discuss that over a video. But in this period, we see him building the temple and also constructing his own house. Already in the constructing of his own house, we see a lavish, abundant structure. Probably the seeds are being sown in that construction of, again, self-reliance and so on. But when we see him build the temple, and when you hear that prayer, what a beautiful prayer in 1 Kings 8. You really see a man, again, who has the right understanding of things. That is just, like I said, it's a very beautiful prayer, well worthy of our time and consideration, both obviously to think about how we might pray to God, but then also to see, effectively how he's teaching us through prayer. But then after he gives that prayer, he's blessed by God, but he's also warned by God. And 1 Kings chapter 9, God can already see that some things, like I said, are just creeping in. God says he's heard this prayer and supplication, verse 3. But then he says, if you walk before me as your father David walked in integrity of heart and uprightness, to do according to all that I've commanded you, and if you keep my statutes and judgments. In other words, you're not going to get exceptional or special treatment. You're going to have to still follow this path of faithfulness. He says, if you'll do that, then I will establish your throne. But if you do not do so, if your sons do not do so, I will cut off Israel from the land that I've given them, in verse number 7. And this house is going to come to nothing, referring to the temple that he has just built. So God wants Solomon to understand that all of this is contingent, and evidently Solomon does for a period of time. You find, of course, the Queen of Sheba coming and praising him and various other things described. But probably during this time also, he authored many, if not all, of the Proverbs, which of course, with the exception of the Agur and the and possibly the Lemuel sections there in chapter 30 and 31. But I don't want to say that I know that for sure. It's possible that Proverbs were kind of written over a lifetime. There's obviously a reason why there's like an edition of the book that's kind of popularized, and then during the time of Hezekiah, some further Proverbs are studied, and so I get the sense that maybe the Proverbs wasn't like a kind of a one and done kind of situation, that was more over time written and then ultimately compiled. But so anyway, that's the first period of his life. And so again, note Song of Solomon and Proverbs come from that first period. The second period of his life is a period in which he is focused on himself. And so he loses sight of God for the sake of himself. He attempts in this period of his life to find a greater purpose in life than what God had given. And this is where, of course, you see him kind of what we would call losing the plot. He multiplies his wives, and his wives lead him into idolatry. The very fact that he would pursue women from these various countries is actually going against Scripture. So obviously he has set aside God's commandments in 1 Kings chapter 11 and verse 2. And then we find that it says in verse 4 that when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. Now, all of that, of course, sounds very bad, and the historical record of Solomon doesn't really give any reason to believe that anything better happened, right? And so the question then is, well, where would the book of Ecclesiastes fit into this picture? Well, the book of Ecclesiastes, I'm going to suggest, represents a third period in Solomon's life. Why is this not covered in the Kings and Chronicles? Because it's covered in the book of Ecclesiastes. But you get the sense, again, that Ecclesiastes is written when Solomon is quite old. Ecclesiastes chapter 4 and verse 13 says, "Better a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who will be admonished no more." Who are we talking about here? Is that just theory? I get the sense that that's Solomon talking about himself as an old and foolish king. So again, not chronicled in the history books, but this is a period in which I suspect that Solomon authored Ecclesiastes. And I do believe in my heart of hearts that the book of Ecclesiastes represents not merely a depressive atheistic message, or not at all depressive atheistic message. I believe it's a message of repentance, and we'll discuss that as we move through the book. And so I think that that's what's on display here. So those are the three periods of his life, and you can see again where that sort of practical wisdom, as it were, took precedence, and then the fruit that unfortunately it gave birth to, or it bore. Talk about some keys to understanding the book. So like I said, this is a book that is just, misunderstood, but it's misunderstood because you don't allow, sometimes interpreters don't allow, or readers don't allow, I should say, there to be changes in perspective that color the material. So I'm going to suggest that the Bible the book kind of gives you its own little hints as to how you are meant to be interpreting certain flows of thought. And so I want you to allow these sort of key words and phrases to be a tool for how you come to understand the meaning of the text, or how you exegete the text. And so there are some in this book materialistic, carnal observations. So statements that are made by effectively a frustrated, person who is coming to grips with failure, and trying to pursue ways other than God's ways. And so you'll see the beginning of these often, Solomon saying, "I returned." We talked about kind of hills and valleys in the book of Job, hills of faith and then valleys of depression. Think about the book of Ecclesiastes as hills of realization, followed by further attempts at non-spiritual fulfillment, like finding fulfillment without God. So you got these realizations, and then turning back and trying something else, coming to a realization, turning back and trying something else. And so when he says "I return," that's a cue that he's getting back into that sort of ungodly mindset. He saw under the sun. Well, these are observations that are made without heaven in mind, effectively. So when you see him saying something about something being under the sun, then he's making an observation that relates purely to life and existence, and typically without God in mind. The realization, again, when one has that perspective, is that it is empty, or that it is the most emptiness, the emptiest of empties kind of things, the vanity of vanities. So when you're reading the word vanity, don't picture a mirror. I don't know the etymology as to why vanity is sometimes referred to as a mirror, but that's not what we're talking about here. The word means something like empty, or and probably maybe other versions will render it differently. But anyway, it's like empty. It's worthless. It's just not. It has no value. Is what that kind of means. And so you can see the frustration and lack of fulfillment he finds. And he pictures that with another phrase: grasping for the wind, grasping for the wind. And so nothing to hold on to, nothing of value there. And you're going to see him using these expressions frequently, especially in, as we're going to say, the first 6 chapters of the book. So
I believe that the source of vanity is because the idea that to be obsessed with yourself is emptiness, right? It's circular, it's self-defeating, it's just turning in on yourself in an empty way that doesn't produce or help anyone else, the community, anything. So vanity means emptiness, and vanity also means self-obsession, because self-obsession is emptiness and fruitless.
Doesn't seem like a good way to sell a mirror to insult the customer.
Yeah.
But
we have, lauded various vices over the years in different ways, right? It's it all comes around when, ooh, it's a bit, racy. It's a bit exciting to be a little bit sinful, right?
Yeah.
Anyway.
It is that is true. So I kind of suspected something like that, but I thought surely there must be some other other meaning here. But the more transcendent and more spiritual observations, you're going to find a different set of words. You're going to find him saying something like, "I perceive." And again, I don't know how your version will render that. I don't make a habit of just checking every version. but he makes an observation that seems to have a more heavenly mindset. And again, that's where he's coming back up to the hill before descending down to the valley. When he talks about things being better, we're starting to view things qualitatively, and seeing the value of God's way as opposed to other ways. Purpose, those thoughts of you kind of see in the conclusion thoughts him holding on to the idea that there is a purpose, and he gets components of that purpose, and it kind of flows through the book. What I hope to do is kind of move through the book, and then kind of maybe when we conclude, try to trace the what I sometimes call the golden thread of Ecclesiastes through these statements of purpose, and see how they kind of all build on each other. I think it will be cool to do that after we've moved through the book, verse by verse. So we make note in terms of so those are the keys of understanding would be to observe the frequently used phrases and what they denote, but then also to make note of the major transition between chapters 6 and 7. So that what I'm going to call the turning point of the book of Ecclesiastes is this question that he asks in chapter 6 and verse 12. He says, "For who knows what is good for man in life, all the days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow? Who can tell a man what will happen to him after the sun?" Now, you know the answer to that question, right? What is it? Or who is it? Not meant to be hard.
Which verse did you read?
What's that?
Sorry, God.
Yeah, God. There we go. All right. I read chapter 6 and verse 12. And so the answer to the questions in chapter 6 and verse 12 is God. And with that question being asked, what follows really in chapter 7, you pick up chapter 7 and it's like you're reading the book of Proverbs again. And it's because now that we've finally come to the conclusion that God knows, we have a section dominated then in chapter 7 and that from that point forward dominated by spiritual observations. So not that under the sun doesn't pop up a couple times in that later section, but it seems to have kind of taken its place with the back on the foundation of God again. And of course we build up to the ultimate conclusion of the book: fear God and keep his commandments. So anyway, let's jump into the text and make sure we have, well, we're right close to a breaking point. And so maybe that would be, rather than jumping into the text and then breaking immediately after doing so, maybe we'll just go ahead and take this opportunity to take a break. So we will pause the recording and come back in just a few minutes.
Okay.
All right. Resuming recording. And sorry I didn't hit that record button earlier. We got our answer on vanities, but if you weren't here for the live class, we'll let you look that up on your own time. So chapter 1, we get an introduction, and then we see life and wisdom being examined. So we open up with these first 3 verses with the introduction and then ultimately the theme. Chapter 1 verse 1, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. So what perspective are we taking of that thought? We're taking a carnal, worldly, non-spiritual perspective. And so how do we know that? We get further confirmation from another one of those expressions in verse number 3, as well as kind of a thought about what we're doing here in verse 3. What profit has a man from all his labor in which he toils under the sun? So if you were living under the sun without a moral compass, without spiritual guidance, without God and his word, what would life be? It would be vanity of vanities. And I like the marginal reading here. It says, or absurdity, frustration, futility, nonsense. And it says, and so throughout the book. In other words, that's the idea here of this vanity concept. Just nothing but absurdity, frustration, futility, and nonsense, without God in the picture. You know, I really marvel when I think about the motivating forces inside of someone who is not a Christian. And honestly, I don't understand those. I mean, I can understand to a degree the idea of pursuing pleasure and pain, but you know, be pursuing pleasure rather than avoiding pain. And you know, I can understand some fulfillment that people might find in relationships, but how often, as we're going to read in this book, how often relationships sour when godliness is not involved, how often pain is not understood when God is not involved, and so on. And so we'll talk about that. But that more or less is what the book is going to discuss, and especially in these first 6 chapters. What proof is there that life under the sun is empty, or again, absurdity, frustration, futility, and nonsense? First proof of this theme is the cyclical nature of life. So verse 4, one generation passes away and another generation comes, but the earth abides forever. Now, this is not Solomon taking a view that the world is eternal, or you know, or yeah, that's what I've said. What I need to say there, that you know, he's not taking the view that the world is eternal, as the words might read at first blush. You read further and you come to understand what he's going to say about the earth. So the earth abides, but what do you find in the earth that shows that no matter how many generations come and go, that they're ultimately all going to experience the same thing? Well, because on this earth, we see existence being dominated by cycles. So one of these cycles, of course, is the cycle of the sun. Verse 5: the sun also rises, the sun goes down, and hastens to the place where it arose. So the sun just moves in a cycle. And again, don't think that you know, he's saying the sun moves. This is not a what's the term? When I first was a preacher, there was a book in the office that made me worry about the previous preachers that were there. There was this book that was written by people who believed that the earth was like the center of the universe and that everything revolved around the earth, and all these Bible verses that supposedly you know, demonstrated that. And this, of course, was one of them, but no, that's not what he's talking about here. This is poetic language, but we're talking about cyclical things. So the sun is cyclical. Wind is also cyclical, which, by the way, in verses 6 and 7, you might be able to argue here that God granted wisdom has led to what we sometimes call pre-scientific information. In other words, before things were discovered by the broader kind of academic world, you find you know, inspired ancients knowing about them. And so verse number 6, we find the circuit of the wind. The wind goes toward the south and turns about toward the north. The wind whirls about continually and comes again on its circuit. And that's ultimately what happens. There's on either side of the hemisphere, there's this cycle of wind. And of course, there are subtle, you know, plays, you know, that sometimes see wind changing movement, but overall, the movement of the wind forms a sort of cycle. And so not only that, but you see reference to the water cycle. So the sun cycle, the wind cycle, the water cycle. Verse 7: rivers run to the sea, yet the sea is not full. To the place where the rivers come, there they return again. And so effectively evaporation and precipitation and condensation. So you find cyclical life in nature, and you find that in this world all things are full of labor. Man cannot express it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. You'll never see it all. You'll never hear it all. You'll never do it all. And so, on top of this cyclical nature of life, you sort of find this frustrating reality of being unable to escape the cycle. And so in verse 9, he says, that which has been is what will be done. That which is done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. So you don't break the cycle. You can find new places to go, but ultimately you're still going places. You can find new things to do, but ultimately you're still doing, exaggerated forms of things that have already been done. So every achievement that man has is some form of something that has already been done. When man blasts into outer space, he has previously flown. When he has flown, he has previously, been carried about on the sea by currents of air with sails. When he's done that, you can keep tracing it back to ultimately to the first man taking a step and walking, because all of those are forms of transportation. There's just nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which it may be said, see, this is new? It has already been in ancient times before us. And further, not only can you not break the cycle in terms of being able to do anything different, you cannot break the cycle in terms of being able to make a lasting impact, as if there could be some kind of fulfillment that was found in that. It says there is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of things that are to come by those who will come after. Yes, you can be remembered by future generations. And of course, right now, we're remembering Solomon. But to say that there's any one individual who has daily impact upon us from the past, with the exception of Jesus, you would struggle to find such an individual. We reference Paul when it suits us, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob when they suit us, Solomon when he suits us, and others from the past when maybe there's something to be benefited from them. But to say that a person can have a truly and abiding, truly impactful and abiding impact upon the future is to say what doesn't exist, in terms of human experience, neither now nor in the time of Solomon. So life is cyclical in nature, and one cannot escape the cycle. Number two, there's a sort of proof of that life under the sun is vain in the futility of wisdom and knowledge. So as we see the kind of, sort of test that he's undertaking set up here in verse number 12, I, the preacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. And he got this idea one day. I set my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all that is done under heaven. And so we're worrying about things under heaven. Under heaven is where maybe God is in the picture, but already we can see under the sun coming into the picture in verse 14. And so with that being where he's going, this is what he says: this burdensome task God has given to the sons of man by which they may be exercised. So already, you say, how does someone who knew so much spiritually speaking just all of a sudden not know it? And the answer is that he didn't not know it. He just chose to see it differently. He knew through wisdom effectively what the purpose of life was, but instead of seeing it as a joyous opportunity, he saw it as a burdensome task. So we're beginning to sort of, in his mind, he's casting off the supposed shackles of spirituality, and let's try to see what we can find without it. But take away burdensome task and reflect upon the fact that God has given life under heaven as the opportunity by which we might be exercised, or by which we might be developed. And another marginal reading there says afflicted, but really there is a sort of soul shaping aspect to this existence. That's a true statement. That's a true thought. But instead of seeing that, he sees it as indeed an affliction, as a burdensome task. And he says in verse 14, I have seen all the works that are under the sun, and indeed it is vanity, all is vanity and grasping for the wind. Now, why? Why is it that those things that people do, are so futile? Because of what they cannot do. In verse 15, what is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be numbered. There is always a point where man ceases to be able to do. Man can do a lot through his wisdom, his ingenuity. I really love examining the history of the space race. I find all that time just fascinating, both in terms of what they were able to do with the technology and the precise nature of what they did. In order to get, this is a little tidbit, not that it has anything to do with anything, but I just, anyway, indulge me. In order to get the computer components to fit in the lunar landing module, they didn't have the technology that we have to store data in, like USB sticks and that kind of stuff. And so what they had to do to get the data that they needed small enough was they had to hand sew binary code. Can you imagine that? Like using needle and thread to sew binary code. If you know anything about binary code, it's the building blocks of data, and it's comprised of zeros and ones. And if you get any of those zeros and ones, if a one is a zero when it should be a one, and vice versa, then the code doesn't work, the program doesn't work, right? And so just think about how meticulous and precise they were to be able to do such a thing. Wow. But at the end of the day, they've achieved only further travel, but not truly anything new. They go to the moon and they discover rocks. We had rocks down here. They didn't find any greater purpose up there or any additional thing. They found further aspects of things that we have here. And nothing's fixed by that journey. Those who have come back from that journey, they live, they die. So they didn't find immortality. They didn't find even in terms of making a lasting impact. I mean, you think about how often those astronauts, even a generation or two after their lifespan, how often they're brought up on a daily basis, and I would say not very often. So again, what is crooked can't be made straight. What is lacking cannot be numbered. There's a sort of lack of fulfillment in what it is that people achieve and do. I communed now again to show that we're really blocking out God from vision here in terms of Solomon's perspective at this point in the story that he's telling. I communed with my heart, not with my God. I communed with my heart, saying, look, I have attained greatness and have gained more wisdom than all who are before me in Jerusalem. My heart has understood great wisdom and knowledge. And so this is where, again, maybe Solomon is describing the wisdom giving way to self-reliance, wisdom causing reliance upon God to give way to self-reliance. And so in verse 17, I set my heart to know wisdom, to know madness and folly. So there's sort of this realization that in attempting to focus on wisdom without God in the picture, already we've done something crazy. And so you can see Solomon introducing that thought for us to reflect upon. Well, why is it so crazy? Why is it so inadequate? There's certain cultures that truly value wisdom and truly value education. I remember my psychology teacher when I was taking my undergraduate classes. I had a psychology teacher from Taiwan, and she talked about her parents emphasizing that education was a treasure that could not be taken away from you, and so how important education is. But when he reflects upon wisdom, when he reflects effectively upon the value of his education, what he knows, he says, this is grasping at the wind. For the more that I know, the more that I am sad. Verse 18, and much wisdom is much grief, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. Why? Well, I don't know that we're left with any one concrete answer to that, but why do you think? Why do you think? Well, one, we've already been given something to think about. The more that we know, the more that we realize we cannot fix, verse 15. But what else? Why is wisdom an avenue to grief, knowledge an avenue to sorrow?
I was just thinking of your space story, and
Yep.
then there was a Japanese astronaut that went to space, and then when he returned, he was quite affected by his experience, seeing the Earth from space. Like he had never seen, very few people have seen it from that perspective.
Yeah.
So he was quite psychologically affected about it, and then basically, it seemed like he became a hermit when he came back. Like it affected him. I was thinking about that kind of experience and gaining that kind of perspective. It affected him that much, and I was wondering about having that kind of wisdom. Like your mind thinks about so many things, and you consider so many things in life that you can't find the answers for everything.
Yep. So the more you know, the more you realize you don't know, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's part of it, I
And
think,
also,
too.
I would like to ask whether in the verse 18, the wisdom here is the same wisdom we use in Job or in any other context. Is this worldly wisdom or is it godly wisdom? If we have more godly wisdom, will it also increase more sorrow?
Well, I think that you have an interpretive choice that you have to make, right? So we've read Proverbs, and we've seen over and over again an emphasis on the value of wisdom. But here, it's almost as though wisdom has no value. And I'd
Yes.
suggest it's not that there's not I don't think that there's a contradiction here. What's our perspective at this point? Where are we? Well, remember, we are under
his
the
wisdom.
sun, verse 14, right?
Mm.
So under the sun, that is without God in mind and without his perspective in mind, wisdom doesn't have value. There's any number of be it movies or books or whatever, where the jaded, experienced figure looks at maybe children or maybe a farm worker or something, or somebody who he perceives to have a very simple life or a simple understanding. He looks at that kind of person or those people. He says, "Oh, I envy them." Well, why? Because his experience hasn't gotten him anything. His wisdom and knowledge haven't gotten him any kind of fulfillment, and he wishes he didn't know. That's where people are when God's not in the picture. So they that again, all these are about, like, we can almost, with some of these statements in Ecclesiastes, we can almost think about them proverbially in that when we speak about wisdom increasing sorrow, how does it do so? Well, we've thought about several different ways now, and I think that the more we do that, the more that we're getting the point. So anyway, questions over chapter 1. Appreciate you asking that, Kate.
And actually, Patrick, I do have a question again regarding wisdom, because when you read in Job back into the chapter, I think 27, Job defends himself with saying that after God created the world, he find wisdom, and the wisdom is actually fear God, and I think it's like fear God is quite similar to the end of Ecclesiastes. They echo other. So considering wisdom is fearing God, if we have no God there, the wisdom actually is nothing.
Yeah, right. The only wisdom of value is that which centers on God. When we get to I'll go ahead and say this now, and I'll probably re-emphasize it because I'll forget that I've said it when we get to chapter 12. But when it says fear God and keep his commandments, it actually says that this is the whole of man. This is the entirety of man. This is all that there is to being a man. And so if you don't get that part right, then nothing is of value, nothing at all. And so that's what he's saying here as relates to wisdom. And we're going to see him make similar conclusions about other things, of course. But yeah, so get God in the picture, and all kinds of things can have value, but without him, nothing has any value. So look at chapter 2, and we'll see him continuing his experiment as relates to pleasure and wealth. So chapter 2, and the first 11 verses, the failure of sensual pleasure. Again, proof that all is vanity under the sun. So failure of sensual pleasure, in other words, those things that provide, experiential pleasure. So in chapter 2, verse 1, I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with mirth. I'll try to spend my life in continuous laughter. I'll just keep on trying to find laughter, therefore, or find reason to be happy. Therefore, enjoy pleasure. But surely this was also vanity. I said of laughter, madness, and of mirth, what does it accomplish? So sometimes when I'm reflecting on this, I'll tell the story of myself. Tell a story on myself from when I was in high school. I used to have this really, really bad habit in high school of I was one of those students that just try to do as little as possible to get by, and I also put things off to the last minute. And can't say that I've totally defeated the procrastination monster in my life, but at the same time, I was exceptionally focused on procrastinating when I was a high school student, and would have a paper due and months away. Get to the night before it was due, and I hadn't done anything yet. And I'd think to myself, well, that assignment might take me maybe 4 solid hours of working, and so let's spend some time. Let's watch some TV. Let's play some video games. Let's talk to my friends on the phone. Whatever. And in all of those things, there'd be laughter and fun and enjoyment to some level. But you laugh, you have fun, you enjoy, and then what doesn't change as the hours tick by? The obligation doesn't change. So you spend all your time laughing, and it doesn't solve any problem. It doesn't accomplish any work. It doesn't achieve anything. And there's just at some point a realization that while laughter is good, is actually it's actually good in small doses, kind of like honey. Too much laughter, a person who pursues laughter to too great of an extent ends up having a very sad and foolish life. It's an interesting kind of thing when I think about some of the comedic figures of our time, and how many of them have struggled with depression and even suicide. I don't know if you know the story of like Robin Williams, for example, or Chris Farley was a 90s comedian and died of a drug overdose. And so these people who you think, well, they're so funny and they live a life of laughter, but there's things happening behind the scenes there that demonstrate that that's not a very fulfilling way to live if that's all that you have. Now, laughter is only one part of one component of this pursuing sensual pleasure. Verse 3, I searched in my heart how to gratify my flesh with wine while guiding my heart with wisdom. Now, therein you have its own sort of self-contradiction. We're going to have the question crop up with Ecclesiastes, just as we do throughout the Old Testament, when the word wine is involved, whether the concept of alcohol is involved. I think that here you can say that this is probably talking about alcohol. and therein might lie another test, and therein might lie the immediate answer to said test. What happens when you pursue a life of indulging in alcohol? Well, what happens is, if you try to maintain your wisdom, you realize eventually, as he says, that's a good way to lay hold on folly. And because alcohol drives away our wisdom. Alcohol drives away our humanity. The more alcohol that we drink, the less of a human being that we are, until ultimately we are reduced to a poisoned, vomitous mass. That's what alcohol does to you. And I speak as a person who had a childhood friend who died because he overdosed on alcohol, vomited, and breathed in that vomit and died, choked on his own vomit because of alcohol. And well, there's not a lot of wisdom in that. There's not a lot of humanity in that. But that's what these things do. So he pursued laughter, foolishness. He pursues wine, foolishness. What about possessions? I made my works great. I've made myself houses, planted vineyards, gardens, orchards, all kinds of fruit trees, verse 5. Verse 6, pools, swimming pools, movie stars like the old Beverly Hillbillies. I don't know if you've ever seen that show. That might be a very American thing, but so pools, and he had servants, it says in verse 7. In terms of what was accumulation of wealth in those days, livestock. He had flocks and herds, more so than anyone else who was around him in Jerusalem, who had lived before him, verse 7 says. Verse 8, I gathered also silver, gold, special treasures. What about music? I acquired male and female singers, the delights of the sons of men, musical instruments of all kinds. And so he had all this stuff, all these possessions. And he says, I became great and excelled more than all who were before me in Jerusalem. My wisdom remained with me. So he still had, that aspect of being able to evaluate these things. And then what happens? It says, whatever he desired, he did not keep himself from. He didn't withhold himself from any pleasure. He rejoiced in all of his labor. There's a sort of fulfillment that comes in being able to accumulate things, right? But then eventually he says, I looked on all the works that I had done, and all the labor in which I toiled, and indeed all was vanity and grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun. Now to see how he gets to that thought after having just said that there was sort of a certain joy that came from accumulation, we're gonna have to do a little bit of thinking. Why has he seen the accumulation of things as something that now he's saying has no profit? There's no profit in this. Well, all right, let's think about it. First of all, let's think about what happened to people. He said, I get all this stuff and I keep my wisdom, right? The first thing that the first kind of component to seeing why possessions and sensual pleasures are failing is a further proof of his examination of life being vanity. But then it's also, we're going to get to that point that kind of is ultimately what he realizes. So first part of the answer is everybody dies. So what happens whether you're wise or you're a fool? In verse 12, and I turn myself to consider wisdom, madness, folly. What can the man do who succeeds the king, or who comes after the king? Only what he has already done. Somebody's coming after me, Solomon says. But then I saw that wisdom excels folly, as light excels darkness. It's so good that I'm wise. The wise man's eyes are in his head. The fool walks in darkness. Yet I myself perceived the same event happens to them all. So even in the course of thinking about the fact that someone's coming after him, he's just patting himself on the back. Good thing I'm wise, good thing that I'm accumulating, doing, and achieving all of this. But then in the course of reflecting upon all of these things in wisdom, he realizes that the same thing happens to them all. And what is that? Well, verse 15. So I said in my heart, As it happens to the fool, it also happens to me. And why was I then the more wise? I said in my heart, this is also vanity. So what happens to the fool, it also happens to the wise. And again, I've already said it, death. The fool and the wise die. And nothing changes that. You know, if you're wealthy, you can access good doctors and good insurance and die. If you're poor, you might not be able to afford those things. You might live a shorter life, but then, of course, you die. And then what happens afterwards? Have you changed anything? Have you achieved anything? Have you made any real difference? There's no more remembrance of the wise than of the fool forever. In fact, when you think about the notable figures of history, it's interesting how often we remember both the wise and the fools. You're just as likely to hear somebody talking about Hitler, a fool, as you are maybe a good leader who was from the past, right? It doesn't really change anything. All that now is will be forgotten in the days to come. And how does a wise man die? As the fool. So there it is. Both die, and ultimately nothing. And therefore he says, I hated life because the work that was done under the sun was distressing to me, for all is vanity and grasping for the wind. You get to the point with enough wisdom, as we're seeing over and over again, that with proper evaluation of life, there's only one consequence if God's not in the picture, and that's depression, frustration. Again, to borrow from that marginal reading, absurdity, frustration, futility, nonsense. So the proof that we see there of, wisdom, again, having its failure, leads him to the further proof that, those sensual pleasures didn't have any real value, and further evaluation of all things material. So what is the failure of materialism? Well, we've just thought about the fact that we're going to die. And what's going to happen after we die? Verse 18, that I hated all my labor in which I had toiled under the sun, because I must leave it to the man who will come after me. So no matter what you achieve and gain and profit in life, ultimately, all that you have is going to be given to somebody else. And what are you going to do? You can specify through a will, I want it to go to that person and not that person. But maybe you die and the United States or New Zealand or whatever country we might be a part of collapses, right? And then what happens? Well, our will is not going to be carried out, obviously. Or even we have a will and we think that we've trained a person to wisely use these things, maybe a child, maybe another family member, and yet we die, and maybe this person that we have been training, or maybe this person that we've seen being faithful to God or whatever, maybe they fall away from the faith, maybe they just totally disappoint our wishes and intentions for them. So he says in verse 19, who knows whether he will be wise or a fool? This person I'll leave my possessions to. Who knows whether he's going to be wise or a fool? Yet he will rule over all my labor in which I have toiled and in which I have shown myself wise under the sun. This is also vanity. I get a sense that maybe Solomon realized a thing or two about Rehoboam. He's already seeing maybe that this is not going to go well for him. You get a sense, if this is at the end of his life, then he's already heard what God has said about the kingdom and being torn from, and so he already realizes that there's going to foolishness is going to result in his sin losing his kingdom. So that kind of adds to this reflection, doesn't it? I turned my heart and despaired of all my labor in which I had toiled under the sun. There is a man whose labor is with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, and he must leave his heritage to a man who has not labored for it. You work really hard, get a lot of stuff, but then you leave it to somebody who didn't have to work at all. This is also vanity and a great evil. For what is man for all of his labor, for all of his striving of his heart, with which he has toiled under the sun? All his days are sorrowful, his work burdensome. Even in the night, his heart takes no rest. This is also vanity. Now, having said all of that, we get to the first of these kind of, I'm alternately going to say something like it being the golden thread that runs through Ecclesiastes, or we can also call it like sort of the hilltop observations here in the book of Ecclesiastes. You get this sort of concluding statement in verse 24. So remember, we talked about how it seems like when he uses a word like better, that we're getting a sense of bringing wisdom back into the picture, right? Let's hear what he says. Nothing is better for a man than that he should eat and drink, and that his soul should enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw was from the hand of God. For who can eat or who can have enjoyment more than I? For God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good in his sight. To the sinner he gives the work of gathering and collecting, that he may give to him who is good before God. This is also vanity and grasping for the wind. All right, so as we think about, again, obviously that turn towards vanity again at the close of that reading, let's reflect upon what we see in the early part of this reading. He says there's nothing better than that a man should effectively find balance with the material possessions of this world. So rather than be given to extremes in pursuing all of these things, there is a sort of value and a sort of wisdom in being able to just take what comes, not be overindulgent or over enamored with these things, but to see them for what they are, see them for their values, see them as coming from the hand of God. So that's the first little time where now God is kind of creeping back into the picture. But as we said, you get down to verse 26, and he sort of snuffs out God again. He sort of pushes them away again. This is vanity. This is grasping for the wind. Why is it that God gets to decide who my possessions go to? Why is it that he's worked it to benefit these certain kinds of people? And that's where we are going to get further reflections that are going to be negative. But even though negativity still is going to follow, we're getting set up here in verse 26 for a discussion that's part of a reflection that moves us towards a solution. Chapter 3 is sort of a digression, if I can call it that, where we stop thinking for a little bit about things that Solomon tried or things that Solomon realized under the sun, to a lesson that sort of helps him to move back in the direction of valuing God and his wisdom again. Because remember, he said something about this idea of providence in verse 26, that God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good in his sight, but to the sinner he gives the work of gathering and collecting, that he may give to him who is good before God. So God is working out his purposes. And then Solomon has to, even though he wants to view all of this as vanity and grasping at the wind, telling the story of his life at this point, he has to pause and realize that God is doing something here. And that's where we find the reflections again of chapter 3, thinking about that. So I've used the word providence there. Let me pause and ask, first of all, let me ask, are there any questions over chapter 2 before we get back on to the topic of chapter 3 and providence?
Excuse me, Patrick, did you just say that even though Solomon find everything was vanity, but he still admit that God was doing something?
Yeah.
God still exists, no matter how you feel life is fertile.
So can you maybe restate the question there?
So I just wondering, the conclusion we get from chapter 2 is, even though Solomon think life was very vanity, means nothing, but even though among this nothing, God is doing something.
Yeah. So wisdom like, I don't know if you have maybe seen a cartoon or something where like, I don't know, like a dam is breaking or something, and the character is like trying to stop the cracks, and he's moving his hands and pushing this point, that point, that point. He's got his toe stuck here, his finger stuck there, got his ear here, like just trying every way to kind of push back. Kind of picture that as Solomon, effectively in these first 6 chapters, especially trying to push back realizations that involve God, because he's in this course of self, because you have to reconcile like how does a guy get to, in 1 Kings chapter 11, how does a guy get to where he begins his reign God honoring, this beautiful prayer in 1 Kings chapter 8, just a really God focused, God honoring man. How does he get to where he's so cold and callous that he's building a high place to a false god? And part of the answer is these women that are in his life, but I have to believe that Ecclesiastes is kind of giving the other part of the answer. Women can as we're going to find later in the book, that they can have an influence on us. Relationships can have an influence on us, but ultimately, a relationship can't drive a fact out of our head. And so Solomon, as he's kind of allowing all of these things, he's just trying to push the knowledge away, but just keeps coming back until he can't deny it. And so we get these little proofs, and then we get these little, like I said, kind of again these hills and valleys. So you're right in saying, yes, God's kind of come back into the picture there in verse 26, but he's going to push him back out again after a bit of a reflection on what he's talked about here in verse 26, this idea, this concept that God has a purpose that he's working out. So maybe it'd be helpful to, again, jump into that discussion and think about, what Solomon kind of learns at this point, or what he recounts at this point about his learning. So what is providence? What does the word mean?
To be provided for.
Yeah, providence is you can see the word provide inside of it. It's a word that people have often used. It's not a word that you can actually do a Bible search in any translation that I'm aware of and find in the Bible, but it's a word that people use to describe God's overarching care worked through the extensions and withholdings of blessing, worked through the free will decisions and operations of individuals, and the harmony of all of these things kind of coming together. Providence would be the story of Joseph, for example. You find cruel brothers sell their brother into slavery, and yet somehow the slave finds his way ultimately into the house of a pharaoh at the time of a famine. There might be little things that God does to insert himself into that story more directly, dreams and interpretations that are there. But the most of what God does in that story is sort of unseen and a kind of moving towards his ultimate purpose. And that is what providence is. So in short, providence is Romans 8:28. It is all things work together for good to those who love God and to those who are called according to his purpose, right? So now that's not in the picture here fully in chapter 3, but nonetheless, we do get a sense that providence is beginning to be understood through wisdom. So let's talk about what providence is from the standpoint of the text. Verse 1, to everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven. So there's a purpose in what happens in life. And then we have this very famous reading, kind of recounting the mountains and the valleys of life that to emphasize that each of these things has their role or purpose. In verse 2, a time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to pluck up what is planted. So again, life, death, inception, and then the end of that, a time to kill, a time to heal, a time to break down, time to build up, a time to weep, laugh, mourn, dance, cast away stones, gather stones, embrace, refrain from embracing, gain, lose, keep, throw away, tear, sow, keep silence, speak, love, hate, war, and peace. So all of these things have their purpose. And so the question is, well, what is this purpose? Now, remember, we've gotten a sense that God has a purpose here, right? We saw it in chapter 1 and verse 13, this burdensome task that God has given the sons of man to be exercised with. Chapter 2 and verse 26, the sinner, he gives the work of gathering, collecting, that he may give to those who are good before God. And so God is doing something behind all of this. And so verse 9, he begins to think about what might be the purpose in all of this. What profit has the worker from that in which he labors? So what do you get for working hard? I've seen the God-given task with which the sons of men are to be occupied. And then here's this kind of little hilltop again realization, even as he's trying to push the wisdom of God out with a statement like in verse 26 of chapter 2, vanity and grasping at the wind and all of that. You find this realization here in verse 11. He says he's made everything beautiful in its time. So there's a purpose in all of this, and things that don't seem truly fulfilling have a sort of beauty. And you can challenge yourself to go through, particularly the negative statements in verses 2 through 8, and say, in what way is that beautiful, or in what way is there beauty on display in some of that? You think about things like war and hatred and these kind of things. Well, the person who follows Christ has to hate father and mother and sister, brother, and his own life also, kind of thing. So hate can be a concept that's necessary for prioritization. You think about stories of war. I mean, some of our favorite stories in terms of cinema are those stories of people who have sacrificed for the good of others. And so there's something that's displayed in warfare that is illustrative of something truly good. And you can go on by reflecting on the good that's found in those negative things. So everything is beautiful in its time. That's part of it. But then number 2, also he has put eternity in their hearts. So eternity in their hearts, what is that? I'm going to suggest that that's what Blaise Pascal referred to as the God-shaped vacuum. The inner self craves God, and so often people find temporary, partial fulfillment in other things, and sometimes they're so deceived by Satan that they can see the value in those things until the day they die. So often, though, they wind up, as we see him kind of winding up under the sun here, in depression, misery. But if you can, instead of allowing that God-shaped vacuum to be filled with other things, if you can focus on the eternal, then you can find, real purpose and fulfillment, as we will get to at the close of the book. So he's put eternity in their hearts, except that no one can find out the work that God does from the beginning to the end. So eternity's in their hearts, and there's sort of this realization that there is no fulfillment in these other things. By the way, God has constructed this world. I know that, verse 12, he says that nothing is better for them than to rejoice and to do good in their lives. And so again, this is one of those kind of concluding kind of realizations here. And so because we see the word better, I know that nothing is better for them than to rejoice and do good in their lives, and also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor. It is the gift of God. What does that sound a lot like? Sounds a lot like chapter 2, verses 24 and 25. And get used to that sentiment, because as he's coming back to, kind of riding the waves and coming back to the wisdom of God, you're going to see him saying that over and over again. And it will be at total harmony, I'm going to suggest, with what he ultimately says in the end, to fear God and keep his commandments. But just we'll trace it out. So anyway, continuing, he says, I know that whatever God does, it shall be forever. Nothing can be added to it, nothing be taken from it. God does it, that men should fear before him. This that which is has already been, and what is to be has already been. God requires an account of what is past. Now, you can see the tone in those statements beginning to shift, can't you? Already now in verses 14 and 15, after having made that kind of hilltop realization of verses 12 and 13, we're returning to similar ideas that we've said, that were said rather back in chapter 1, right? That cyclical nature of life. And now we've brought in with, kind of that fervor of pushing God away, the idea that God is going to make an account of us for all of these things. And so he kind of rethinks, reexamines, reevaluates, and he tries to build a little case against God. And so verse 16, moreover, I saw under the sun. All right, so worldly perspective coming back into the picture. God's out, my wisdom's in the place of judgment, wickedness was there, and in the place of righteousness, iniquity was there. I mean, this is supposed to be all about discovering the eternal. It's supposed to be all about there's supposed to be appropriate beauty in these various things that happen, but no, Solomon says effectively, what about the problem of evil? What about the problem in this case of bad people being in places where they ought not be, and the spiritual leaders being what they ought not be, and so on. But he says it says in verse 17, I said in my heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every purpose and for work. You kind of see him debating himself with some of these statements, but now we kind of come to another sort of depressive thought, because without reflecting on the eternal, we see only the temporal, and then we just basically are getting back to this idea of death, and that usually doesn't signify something good for Solomon when he gets just thinking about death. That's the kind of his realization that things are futile and so on. So it says in verse 18, I said in my heart concerning the condition of the sons of men, God tests them, that they may see that they themselves are like animals. That's not encouraging, is it? But in what way? Well, he's talking about death. For what happens to the sons of men also happens to the animals. One thing befalls them, as one dies, so dies the other. So now we got this depressive thought in our mind. We're shoving God away. They all have one breath. Men are like animals. There's no advantage to being a man. All is vanity. So there you go. So the debate is there, but we're not ready to bring God back into the picture because of the problem of evil, because of injustice prevailing, and also now because of the reality of death. And I'll go to one place. He says, verse 20, all are of the dust and return to the dust. But then you have this potential in verse 21 to see yet another little turning point, because it says in verse 21, who knows the spirit of the sons of men, which goes upward, and the spirit of the animal, which goes down to the earth? Is that him making a differentiation between man and beast? Because later that differentiation is going to be clear, right? When you get to chapter 12, he's going to say that the spirit returns to God who gave it. Because again, viewing things totally from a spiritual perspective, there's a big difference between when animals die and when people die, right? Because people are made in the image of God. And so maybe maybe in verse 21, he's saying something like that, or allowing that thought to get its, kind of toe in the door, so to speak, or a little bit of water comes through the dam that's breaking here. So then again, you find that word better, verse 22. So I perceive that nothing is better that a man should rejoice in his works, for that is his heritage. For who can bring him to see what will happen after him?
Patrick, the other day I was thinking about my dogs, because I know that the dog has no soul. After they die, they come from dirt, they go back to dirt. So
Yeah.
what's the purpose about dog? Because they also undergo stress, sadness, illnesses. And what is his life to me then? So what's the purpose of this companion animal around us? And I had the same question of Solomon. The spirit, yeah, I know human has hope, because after die we can hope we can go to heaven, but to them there's no hope. Then why do they leave?
Yeah. A lot of people do wonder that love their pets, and but obviously there is something to be valued in animals. When you read certain statements in the Psalms that talk about the animals being cared for by God, and it's like, well, maybe it's just an aspect of of us that's like God, that we value these living creatures, and maybe maybe there's little things that we learn along the way. We made the decision, as our family is concerned, to have a dog, and part of that wasn't just a great love for having dogs in the house. I mean, dogs can be very inconvenient, be a big inconvenience from time to time, but we just liked the lessons that we were going to teach our kids with having a dog, like taking care of the dog, feeding the dog, walking the dog, giving the dog water, and then the companionship that we knew that they were going to have with that dog. And then ultimately, when that dog ages, which happens more quickly than us as human beings, the lesson in mortality that would be there for our children. They're going to see that dog age, they're going to see it die, and they're going to be reminded from a very young age, therefore, that they will age and they will die. So I think if you think long enough about animals and so on, you'll start to see some spiritual benefit to the order of things, right? Now, to say I know all the reasons why God created animals, I don't, but something. I think that, I don't know if it was, it seemed like a Thomas Warren thing to say. I can't remember if he said this or not, but to describe the world as a believer, you say that the world that we live in is the best possible world of all possible worlds that could be designed for the purposes that God has intended, right? So every aspect of the world, be it our lifespan, or the shapes and contours of the world, or the prevalence of water, or the existence of animals, or anything, like all the attributes of our world represent the perfect environment for what God hoped to achieve here, and that is for souls to be shaped and fashioned for eternity. As he says in verse 11 again, he's put eternity in their hearts, and so it contributes to that in some way, but I don't know all the ways that it does. So sorry, I can't say more about that. But
good explanation. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. And but I think that you do see here again the difference between the man and the beast, and you're right. The animal dies, and yet there's something gained in its life. But to get back to the question that I asked, or that Solomon rather asked in verse 22, who can bring him to see what will happen after him? Well, the answer is God. But we're not fully ready to get God back in the picture as we get into chapter 4. So we're going to see as chapter 4 opens up, then I returned. So be prepared for more failed proofs of or rather more proofs of failure, I should say, more proofs of the vanity of life in chapter 4 and following. But you can see already again in chapter 3 the debate. I don't believe we'll try to tackle chapter 4 tonight. We've just already crept over the time a little bit. So any final questions on the first 3 chapters of Ecclesiastes? All right, well, let's go ahead and have a closing word of prayer. Father, we praise you for the magnificent way that you have designed this world. We thank you, Father, for the beauty of it, the beauty of the good, obviously, but then helping us to see the beauty and the power in even what at first seems to be bad. We're thankful that this world has been designed in the way that it has, and that we are given the opportunity to find its beauty, but then also to find you. We're thankful that you've put eternity into our hearts, and that you have given us enough wisdom so as to not be satisfied with incomplete answers. We're thankful that we've been able to come to you, and that we have been able to reflect upon not only your saving gospel, but also the beautiful messages of wisdom, such as those found in the book of Ecclesiastes. Father, we pray that you will help us not to pursue satisfaction in anything that is less than total commitment and service to you. Help us not to be distracted by sensual pleasure, by material goods. Help us not to pursue knowledge and wisdom and academic achievement to the extent of forgetting who you are and what you've called us to do. Help us to prioritize you and put you first in all that we do. And we offer this in the name of your son, Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
All right.